The notification light cut through the expensive shadows of the penthouse office like a blade. It was 11:42 p.m., a time when Han Jae-sung's phone usually vibrated with cold logistics. Shipment arrivals, territory disputes, or the silent confirmation of a hit. But this vibration was different. It was a frantic, irregular buzzing from an unknown, unlisted number. Jae-sung looked down, his sharp jaw tightening as the text appeared on the screen. "He's beating my mama. Please help." The Korean Mafia boss stared at the glowing words, his contemplative expression momentarily replaced by a rare flicker of confusion. A mistake, a scam, a wrong number. But then, a second message appeared, shorter, shakier, and filled with a terror that felt hauntingly familiar. "I'm hiding. He said he'll kill her." Jae-sung's breath stilled. He was a man who had built an empire on iron and silence. A man who had caused fear in the hearts of the city's most hardened criminals. But he had never seen a child beg a monster for mercy because she had no one else left. Something in those words, that trembling, raw desperation, pierced through the business-only facade he had worn for years, reaching a part of him he thought had died in the rainy streets of Seoul decades ago. Without a second thought, his fingers flew across the screen. He typed only 3 words, "On my way." His lieutenants froze as the boss stood up, the light catching the dark, intricate ink of the dragon tattoo exposed at his collar. He didn't grab a weapon. His presence was the weapon. "Boss, where are you going?" they called out, but Jae-sung didn't answer. He didn't need to. As his black sedan tore through the city, the skyline blurring into golden streaks against the glass, one final message appeared. "I hear footsteps. Please hurry." Jae-sung gripped the steering wheel, his pulse hammering against his skin. By the time he reached the modest house on Mitchell Street, he already knew. Tonight, he wasn't arriving as the dragon of the Korean syndicate. He was arriving as the only hope Soraya Mitchell had left. And what he found inside that house would not only change Soraya's life, it would shatter Han Jae-sung's world forever. Stay with me until the end, because the secret Jae-sung discovered in that living room will make your heart stop and start again. Before we dive into this incredible journey of redemption, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Now, let's get started. The city looked different from 42 floors up. Smaller, quieter, like something Han Jae-sung owned. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with a glass of water, never alcohol, not during work hours, and it was always work hours, and watched the lights below arrange themselves into the shape of everything he'd built. A shipment cleared through the port tonight without incident. A councilman who'd gotten curious about the wrong warehouse had, as of this afternoon, stopped being curious. 2 rivals in the Eastern District were currently negotiating the terms of their own irrelevance without knowing he'd already written the terms for them. The Empire did not sleep. It simply changed shifts. He turned back to his desk. The lamp cast a clean gold circle over the open ledger, numbers that meant things only 3 people in the world understood. Written in a shorthand he'd invented at 22 when he realized that clarity was a liability. His suit jacket was folded over the back of the chair. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, the ink of his tattoo disappearing beneath the fold of fabric, the serpent's tail curling toward his wrist. His phone sat at the corner of the desk. For contacts, no notifications. Shinwoo had texted through the secondary line an hour ago. Shipment confirmed, no flags, and Jae-sung had replied with a single period, which meant acknowledged, do not contact again tonight. His men had learned to read him the way sailors learned to read weather. Not because he explained himself, because the cost of misreading him had proven, over the years, to be instructive. They called him boss the way other men said sir to someone holding a loaded weapon. Respectful, careful, never warm. He preferred it that way. He sat down, uncapped a pen, and pulled the next page of the ledger toward him. The building was silent except for the low hum of the city outside and the faint tick of the clock on the far wall. He had 40 minutes of work left, then 4 hours of sleep. Then the day would begin again, the same as every day before it, controlled and bloodless and entirely his. Then his personal phone vibrated. He didn't look at it immediately. No one used that number for anything urgent. Nothing in his world moved faster than his secondary line. He finished the figure he was writing, capped the pen, and reached for the phone. Unknown number. He almost set it back down. Almost. He's beating my mama. I don't know who else to call. Please. Jisung read it once. Twice. The clock ticked. Somewhere in the city 42 floors below, a child was hiding with a phone and a wrong number and the specific, terrified hope of someone who had run out of options and was trying one more thing before giving up entirely. He picked up the pen. Set it down again. Typed one word. Address. He didn't tell anyone. That was the first thing. The thing that would have alarmed his men more than anything else, if they'd known. Han Jisung did not move through the city alone. He had drivers, escorts, a rotating security detail that operated like a second shadow. To go anywhere without them was not protocol. To go somewhere unknown in the middle of the night without a word to anyone, that was the kind of decision that got people killed. He took his own keys from the drawer and walked to the private elevator. The parking structure on sublevel 3 held 6 cars. He took the black one. Not the armored one, not the one Shinwoo always prepped for late runs, just the car. He pulled out of the structure and into the street and the city opened up around him, indifferent and bright, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, no one knew where he was. He drove the way he did everything, without wasted movement, each turn deliberate, both hands on the wheel. The address the girl had sent was 40 minutes northeast. Working-class neighborhood. Apartment buildings stacked close together. The kind of block the city forgot to maintain. He knew the type. He'd grown up 3 streets from one. The radio stayed off. He didn't need noise. What he needed was to focus on the road and not on the thing stirring quietly in his chest. The thing he hadn't felt in so long he'd half convinced himself it had died. He kept his jaw set and his eyes forward and he drove. 12 minutes out, the phone buzzed in the cup holder. He glanced down at the next red light. He's not stopping. She's not moving. 5 words. No punctuation on the second sentence. The kind of detail a person only omits when their hands are shaking. Jisung looked at the light. Looked at the message again. The light turned green and he pressed the accelerator with a steadiness that did not match what was happening behind his eyes. She's not moving. He didn't let himself think about what that meant. He had learned, a long time ago, that thinking too far ahead in situations like this produced a specific kind of feeling he had no use for, the helpless, hollowing fear of someone racing toward something they might already be too late for. He had felt it once before. He had promised himself he would never feel it again. He was feeling it now. The city thinned out as he pushed further from the center. The towers gave way to mid-rises, then to flat-fronted buildings with fire escapes and corner stores with their lights still on. A couple argued on a stoop. A dog barked somewhere above the street. Normal life, ordinary and ongoing. Completely unaware that a man in a black car was threading through it with his whole body wound tight around a name he didn't even know yet. He thought about the text. The grammar of it. I don't know who else to call. Not I called the wrong number. Not sorry to bother you. She hadn't apologized. She'd just explained. There was something in that. A kid who was scared down to her bones but still thinking clearly. Still precise. He respected that without meaning to. The GPS announced his exit. He took it without slowing more than necessary, the tires quiet against the wet asphalt, and drove toward the building on Lenox like he had always been headed there. The light at the corner of Lenox and 9th turned red. He stopped, and in the silence of the idling engine, with 3 blocks left to go and his hands still on the wheel, it found him. The way it always did when he let his guard down for half a second too long. Not as a memory he chose, but as one that chose him. Jian. She had been loud in the particular way of people who are never trying to be. Always talking, always moving. Always appearing at his bedroom door with her socks mismatched and his headphones already around her neck. The cord trailing behind her like she just grabbed them mid-thought, which she usually had. Jisung, listen to this part. Just this part, I promise. She never meant just one part. He never minded. She was 12 years old in the memory. She was 12 years old in every memory, because she had not been given the chance to become anything else. He had been 23 when the call came. A city away, closing a deal that had taken 4 months to arrange, his secondary phone in his jacket pocket and his personal one. The one only she had the number to, sitting on the nightstand in his hotel room. He had been in that meeting for 6 hours. He had not checked it once. There had been 4 missed calls by the time he got back to the room. The last one wasn't from her. He remembered the detective's voice. Measured, professional, the specific flatness of someone delivering news they had delivered too many times. He remembered sitting down on the edge of the bed without deciding to. He remembered the window, the city outside going on exactly as it had before, ordinary and endless, completely unaware that something had just gone permanently wrong. He had driven through the night to get back. For hours. He remembered every red light. The apartment had been cordoned off by the time he arrived. Her building, the one he had been meaning to move her out of for 2 years, the one with the thin walls and the neighbor who drank and the lock on the front door that stuck in cold weather, was wrapped in yellow tape and blue light. He had stood on the sidewalk outside it in his suit from the meeting, and he had understood, with a completeness that felt like drowning, that he had been too far away. He buried her on a Tuesday. Gray sky, thin rain. He stood at the grave after everyone else had left, and he made her a promise in a voice that didn't sound like his own. Low and wrecked and certain in the way that only grief can make a person certain. I'll never be too far again. He had broken it the very next day, and every day for 11 years after that. He had built walls and distance and an empire that required him to be unreachable. He had told himself it was survival. He had told himself Ji-yeon would have understood. The light turned green. Ji-sung exhaled through his nose and lifted his foot from the brake. The car moved forward, slow and steady, and he did not wipe his face because there was nothing to wipe. He had not cried in 11 years either, and whatever was sitting behind his eyes right now was staying there. 3 blocks. He tightened his grip on the wheel. She's not moving. He drove. He found parking half a block down and walked the rest. The building was 4 stories, brick gone gray from decades of weather. A front door propped open with a paint can that had probably been there long enough to become furniture. The kind of building that functioned, lights worked, pipes ran, people came home to it, but that no one had looked at carefully in years. Ji-sung stepped inside without breaking stride. The elevator was out of service. A handwritten sign taped to the doors said sorry for inconvenience, with 2 exclamation points that felt optimistic given the circumstances. He took the stairs. The stairwell smelled like old carpet and someone's dinner. 3rd floor. A television murmured behind a closed door. 4th floor. The hallway light above apartment 4C buzzed and flickered with the particular exhaustion of something that had been failing slowly for months and hadn't quite finished yet. He walked toward it and the light stuttered over him in uneven intervals. Present, gone, present, gone. He could hear it before he reached the door. Not screaming. Something worse than screaming. The low, ugly sounds of a confrontation that had moved past shouting into something more deliberate. A voice, male, with the specific cadence of someone who had stopped needing an audience for what they were doing. A sound beneath it that Ji-sung's mind categorized and then immediately refused to sit with. He stopped outside for C. His phone had buzzed 6 times on the drive over. He hadn't read them until now, standing in the flickering hallway with one hand loose at his side. He scrolled up through what Soraya had sent him over the last 40 minutes and read them in order, the way you'd read a record of something that should never have been allowed to happen. He threw something. I heard it break. She's crying but she stopped screaming. I don't know if that's good. Are you real? Like, are you actually coming? I'm in my room. I pushed the dresser. Please hurry. I can hear her. He stood with the phone in his hand and read them twice. Not because he needed to, he'd understood them the first time, but because something in him needed a moment with the fact of them. This girl had texted a stranger's number in the dark and then, instead of going silent, instead of giving up when silence was the only thing she got back for the first few minutes, she had kept sending. Small dispatches, updates, evidence. She had narrated the worst night of her life to a man she had no reason to trust because the alternative was bearing it completely alone. She had trusted a stranger more than she trusted the silence. He thought about Ji-yeon, who had called 4 times and gotten a hotel nightstand. He thought about what it would have meant if someone had just answered. He put the phone in his pocket. The door in front of him was hollow core. He could tell from the frame, the cheap hardware, the way sound moved through it like it was barely there. The lock would take less than a second. He didn't reach for his tools. He tried the handle first, on instinct. It was unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, not because he was hesitant, but because he wanted to see everything before anything in that room knew he was there. The light from inside fell across the hallway floor in a pale yellow strip. He stepped through it. The apartment was small and had been lived in with care. That was the first thing Jisung registered. Not the overturned chair, not the broken glass near the baseboard, but the things that existed before tonight. The framed photos arranged along the hallway wall. The plant on the windowsill healthy and tended. A child's drawing held to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sun. Someone had built a home here deliberately and with limited means, and what had been done to it tonight was not just violence against a person. It was violence against everything she had made. Amara Mitchell was on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet. One arm drawn up against her chest, her head turned to the side. She was conscious. He could see the shallow movement of her breathing, the slow blink of her eyes adjusting to the light. But she was not moving. Not because she couldn't. Because she had learned, at some point during the course of this night, that moving made it worse. Darius Cole stood over her. He was broader than Jisung had pictured, with the particular build of a man who had once been athletic and now used the memory of it as permission. His shirt was untucked. There was a glass in his hand. Not raised, just held, the casual possession of someone who had not yet decided he was finished. He was saying something in a low, continuous voice, the kind that doesn't require a response and isn't looking for one. He heard the door. He turned. What happened to his face in the first second was the most honest thing about him. Not anger, not surprise, something more revealing than either. A flicker of recalculation. The instinctive animal recognition that the variable had changed, and the variable was standing in the doorway in a black jacket with no expression at all, and it was not what he'd been expecting, and he did not know what to do with that. Jisung stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He did not move toward Darius. He stood exactly where he was, in the narrow space between the entryway and the kitchen, and he looked at him the way he looked at ledgers, with complete attention and no feeling whatsoever visible on his face. "Put the glass down," he said. His voice was quiet, conversational, almost. The kind of tone that didn't need the room to go silent because it assumed the room already had. Darius put the glass down. "Step back from her." He stepped back. 2 full steps without deciding to, his body responding before his ego caught up. That was the thing about men like Darius Cole. They understood power instinctively, in their bodies, even when their minds were still constructing a reason not to be afraid. His mind was working on it. His body had already conceded. Jisung crossed the kitchen without hurrying and crouched beside Amara. He didn't touch her. He positioned himself between her and Darius and looked at her directly. Not with pity, not with the particular discomfort of someone who didn't know where to look. He looked at her the way you look at someone you are taking seriously. "You're going to be all right," he said. Low, even certain in a way that wasn't a comfort so much as a fact he was deciding on her behalf. Then he stood, and he turned back to Darius. And whatever had been on his face when he spoke to Amara was gone. "Now," he said quietly, "you and I need to talk." He didn't raise his voice once. That was the thing Darius Cole would carry with him long after he left the city. Not a threat, not a weapon, not even a hand laid on him. Just a man who spoke at a normal volume with the specific patience of someone who had never once needed to perform being dangerous, because the real thing required no performance at all. Jisung walked him to the far side of the living room, away from Amara, and stood close enough that the conversation stayed private. Not close enough to touch. He put his hands in his pockets, which somehow made it worse. The complete absence of aggression, the complete absence of anything that would give Darius a posture to respond to. "I'm going to tell you what happens next," Jisung said. "And I need you to listen carefully, because I'm only going to say it once." Darius opened his mouth. "I haven't asked you anything yet," Jisung said, in exactly the same tone. "When I do, you'll know." The mouth closed. Jisung looked at him for a moment. Not sizing him up, he'd already done that. He was simply letting the silence establish itself as a presence in the room, and then he began. He told Darius, in plain and specific language, what his life would look like if he remained in this city. He did not use the word consequences. He did not use the word warning. He described a set of outcomes with the calm precision of someone reading from a document they had written in advance, which in a sense was true. Jisung had known men like Darius Cole his entire life, had grown up beside them and later built an empire partly structured around making sure they understood their place within a larger order. This was not new territory. This was just a different address. He talked about the city, about how much of it was known to him and how little of it would remain navigable for a man whose name he now had. about the specific limitations that would begin accumulating around Darius's life. Quietly, invisibly, the way water finds the cracks in a foundation. If he chose to stay or return or reach out to Amara or Soraya in any form, through any channel, for any reason. He did not threaten his life. He didn't need to. What he described was something Darius understood more viscerally than death. The slow, total erosion of everything that made him feel like a man who had options. Darius believed him. Not because the words were frightening, though they were. Because there was no electricity in them. No anger, no personal investment. No desire to see him suffer. Jisung spoke about Darius's future the way a doctor speaks about a prognosis. Not wanting it to be true exactly, just reporting what was already decided. That was the thing that reached him, underneath the bravado and the defense and the voice in his head that had been telling him for years that he was the most dangerous person in any room he entered. He was not in that room anymore. Your keys, Jisung said. Leave them. Darius looked at him for a long moment with something that might have been the beginning of an argument. Then he reached into his pocket, set his keys on the coffee table, and walked to the door. He did not take anything else. He did not speak. He pulled the door shut behind him with the careful, deliberate click of a man who understood, at last, that some doors don't open again. The apartment went quiet. Jisung stood in the middle of it and listened to the silence settle, and then he turned back toward the kitchen where Amara was still on the floor, and he went to her. He helped Amara to the couch first. Not carried, she was conscious enough to resist that, and he respected it. He offered his arm and she took it after a moment's hesitation. The hesitation of someone who had learned recently and painfully to mistrust the proximity of men. He moved slowly and didn't speak and let her set the pace. And when she was settled he crouched in front of her and looked at her injuries with the same careful, unsentimental attention he'd given her earlier. Her wrist was swollen. A cut above her eyebrow had dried but needed closing. Her breathing was even, which mattered most. He made one call. Not an ambulance. Too many questions, too much paperwork. Too many ways for a night like this to become a record that followed her. He had a doctor. Everyone in his world had a doctor. He gave the address in under 10 seconds, received a confirmation in under 5, and hung up. Someone's coming, he told her. 20 minutes. You don't have to explain anything to him. She looked at him with the dark, exhausted eyes of a woman trying to determine what category of person he belonged to. He didn't help her with that. He just stood, walked to the front door, and stepped into the hallway to wait. The flickering light above 4C had finally given up entirely. The hallway was dim, lit only by the stairwell glow at the far end. Jisung leaned against the wall opposite the door and put his hands back in his pockets and looked at nothing in particular. He heard the bedroom door before it opened. Small sounds, the scrape of something heavy being moved, the particular careful quiet of someone who had been holding very still for a very long time and was now deciding it was safe to stop. Then the front door and footsteps, and she was in the hallway. Soraya Mitchell was younger than he'd pictured and more composed than she had any right to be. Her natural curls were pulled slightly to one side, flattened where she'd been pressed against a wall or a door for the last hour. There were tear tracks dried on both cheeks and fresh ones threatening at the corners of her eyes. But her jaw was set and her posture was straight, and she was still holding her phone in both hands. Screen dark now, the way you hold something you needed desperately and aren't ready to put down yet. She stopped when she saw him, looked at him the way she'd looked at everything tonight. He imagined, directly, with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who had already survived the worst part and wasn't going to waste the aftermath on pretending. You actually came, she said. Not grateful exactly. Not relieved. Something more precise than either, the specific tone of someone whose gamble had paid off and was still slightly astonished by it. Yes, he said. She studied him for a moment. The suit, the tattoo at his collar, the complete absence of any readable emotion on his face. Then, who are you? Nobody you need to know about. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. She looked at him a moment longer, weighing something. Then she said, quietly and without accusation, Why did you come? You didn't have to. The hallway light flickered weakly at the far end. Jisung looked at the wall across from him for a long moment, not avoiding the question, just finding the truest version of the answer. Someone should have come for her too, he said. Soraya didn't ask who her was. She just looked at him with those clear, serious eyes, and nodded once, slowly, like she understood not the specifics but the weight of it, which was the part that mattered. They stood in the quiet hallway together and waited for the doctor. The doctor arrived in 19 minutes. He was older, silver-haired, carried a bag that looked like an ordinary briefcase and wasn't. He took in the apartment with the practiced neutrality of someone who had made calls like this before and understood that discretion was the entirety of his job description. Jisung met him at the door, exchanged 4 words, and stepped back. The doctor went to Amara without being directed, and Jisung returned to the hallway. Soraya followed him out. He glanced at her sideways. She had pulled her curls back while she was inside. A practical, unsentimental gesture. The kind of thing you do when you've decided the crisis is survivable and your hands need something to do. She leaned against the wall beside him, not close, and looked at the middle distance with the focused expression of someone actively not falling apart. They stood in silence for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had already been through something together and didn't need to fill it. Then she said, without looking at him, "You never answered my question." "Which one?" "Why you came." She paused. "You said someone should have come for her too." "That's not an answer. That's the edge of one." He said nothing. "I'm not going to tell anyone about you," she said. "I don't even know your name. I'm just asking because—" She stopped, chose her words carefully. "Because you drove 40 minutes alone in the middle of the night for someone you've never met, and I want to understand that. People don't do that. Some do. Not in my experience." He looked at the wall. Across from him, the faded paint, a small scuff mark at knee height that had probably been there for years. Someone's child, running down the hallway. "I had a sister," he said. He didn't plan to say more than that. The words came out of him the way things surface when you've kept them submerged long enough. Not dramatically, just quietly, with the inevitability of something that had been waiting. "She was younger than me. 12. He paused. "There was a night. Someone was hurting her and I wasn't there. I was somewhere else, doing something that felt important, and my phone was in another room, and by the time I got the calls..." He stopped. Resumed. "I was too far away." Soraya had gone very still beside him. "I made her a promise at her grave," he said, "that I wouldn't be too far again." He let a moment pass. "I've spent 11 years breaking it." The hallway held the words. He didn't look at Soraya. He kept his eyes forward and his voice level, and he waited for the familiar numbness to return and close back over it. The way it always did when Ji-Yun surfaced. That practiced, necessary shutdown that had kept him functional for over a decade. It didn't come. "She would have liked that you came," Soraya said. Simple. Quiet. Not an attempt to fix anything or reframe it or offer comfort in the way people offered comfort when they didn't know what else to do. Just a true thing stated plainly, by a girl who had spent tonight proving she understood the difference between what was real and what was just noise. Something in Jisung's chest moved in a way it hadn't in 11 years. He didn't speak. He couldn't, for a moment. He stood in the dim hallway of a building he'd never been to before tonight, beside a girl who had trusted a stranger with the worst night of her life, and he let it land. All of it, the grief and the guilt and the long, exhausting weight of a promise he had almost let die with her. He didn't cry. But he didn't close it off either. For the first time in a very long time, he just let it be there. 6 weeks later, the Mitchells moved into an apartment on the 4th floor of a building with a working elevator. It was not a grand place, but the hallway lights worked, all of them, and the lock on the front door was new, and the windows faced east so the mornings came in clean and unhurried. Amara had stood in the empty living room on the first day with her hands at her sides and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Soraya had watched her from the doorway and understood that some things didn't need words, that sometimes a person just needed a moment to believe that a space was actually theirs and that nothing was coming to take it. They didn't know who had arranged it. The lease had appeared through a legal firm that answered questions politely and completely without detail. The medical bills from that night had been settled before Amara received them. The matter of Darius Cole had been handled through channels that left no visible fingerprints. A formal restraining order, yes, but also something quieter and more permanent underneath it, the kind of arrangement that didn't show up in any court record but that meant Darius had left the city within a week and had not looked back. Soraya had her theories. She kept them to herself. She was unpacking her room on a Tuesday afternoon. Books first, always books first, when she noticed the envelope on the floor just inside the front door. No stamp, No name on the outside. Just a plain white rectangle that hadn't been there an hour ago. She opened it standing in the hallway. Inside was a single index card. On it, written in clean and precise handwriting, was a phone number she didn't recognize. Below it, one sentence. If you ever need someone to answer. She read it twice, stood with it in her hand for a moment, the afternoon light coming through the eastward window and falling across the floor in a long gold stripe. Then she folded it carefully, went to her room, and placed it in the front pocket of the notebook she kept on her nightstand. She didn't tell her mother. Some things you hold privately, not because they're secret but because they belong to a particular part of you that you're still figuring out. She thought about a man in a hallway who had looked at a wall before telling her the truest thing about himself. She thought about 2 words sent into the dark address and what it meant that he'd asked. She thought about Ji-yun, 12 years old forever, and the brother who had driven 40 minutes alone to keep a promise he'd been breaking for 11 years. She hoped he was all right. In the penthouse 42 floors above the city, Han Jae-sung sat at his desk at 11:58 p.m., and the empire continued exactly as it always had. Shipments confirmed. Rivals managed. The ledger open, the lamp gold, the city small and quiet below. His personal phone sat at the corner of the desk. He picked it up, opened the contacts. 5 names now where there had been 4 for 11 years. He looked at the 5th one for a moment. Soraya M. Then set the phone back down and returned to the ledger. He did not know if she would ever use the number. He did not know if he would. That was not the point. The point was that for the first time in 11 years, the door was open. He had left it that way on purpose. That was enough. Thank you for listening. There are always more stories for you. See you in our next video.